I never thought I'd be sharing this story, but looking back at everything that happened over the last 2 decades, I feel like it might help someone else going through something similar. I was 32 when my world turned upside down. At the time, I had 3 wonderful kids. My oldest was 8, the middle one was 4, and I was expecting my youngest. My husband worked at a big accounting firm downtown, and I thought we had the perfect life. We'd been married for 10 years, lived in a nice suburb, and our kids were doing great in school. Then I found out about Sarah. She was his new secretary, fresh out of high school and taking evening classes at the local community college. I didn't think much of her at first. She was just someone who worked for my husband. But when I was 7 months pregnant with our youngest, I discovered their affair. The worst part wasn't even finding out about the affair. It was learning that Sarah was pregnant too. When I confronted my husband, he didn't even try to deny it. Instead, he told me he wanted a divorce. Just like that, 15 years of marriage ended. The next few months were a blur. I had my baby, filed for divorce, and watched as my husband married Sarah just 3 months after our divorce was finalized. They went on to have 2 more kids together. My ex-husband's family was something else entirely. They were all successful lawyers and doctors, the kind of people who judge you based on your job title rather than your character. They hated any kind of family drama that might tarnish their precious reputation. So my ex would put on this big show whenever his family was around, pretending to be the perfect father to our kids. The reality was very different. He'd pay child support on time, I'll give him that. But he'd only see the kids once a month, if that. Whenever the kids needed something, he'd buy it without question. But he wouldn't even pick up their calls until he knew I'd already handled whatever they needed. He never showed up to their football games or school plays unless his mother or aunts were going to be there. Our kids weren't blind. They saw their half-sister getting taken on fancy family vacations while they were left out. My ex would tell his family that the kids didn't want to go, claiming I took them on too many trips anyway. It was all lies, but I kept quiet for years to keep the peace. Everything came to a head during last year's Christmas party. My youngest, now 18, overheard her half-sister talking about an upcoming family trip to Barbados. When she asked about it, her half-sister mentioned how their dad said they had other plans. Right there, in front of everyone, my daughter said she had no plans and would love to come along. That's when things started getting messy. When my kids got invited to that Barbados trip, I decided to go along. I know it might sound strange, but I'd known my ex's family since high school and was still close with his sister. Plus, I wasn't comfortable with my kids being that far away with a father who barely showed up for them. Sarah wasn't happy about me coming, but she couldn't really say anything since my ex's family had invited me. During one of the dinner parties on the trip, everyone was catching up about their lives. My kids were doing exceptionally well. My oldest was in medical school, and the other 2 were at top universities. My ex's mother was beaming with pride, asking about each of her grandchildren's achievements. Then she asked about Sarah's daughter. Everyone at the table got quiet because there had been rumors going around that she'd gotten into some prestigious college. My ex's mother was practically bouncing in her seat, ready to hear the good news. But instead of announcing college acceptance, my ex's daughter dropped a bomb. She was pregnant. The silence in that room was deafening. You could have heard a pin drop. My ex's mother's face went from excited to shocked in seconds, and everyone else just stared at their plates. That's when things really fell apart. My ex started blaming Sarah's parenting, saying she was too lenient. Then he had the nerve to point at our kids as examples of successful parenting, as if he had anything to do with it. He actually tried taking credit for how well our children turned out. I'd kept quiet about his absent parenting for years, but something in me snapped. Right there, in front of his whole family, I told them the truth. I explained how he only showed up when they were around, how he'd ignore the kids' calls, and how he'd never been there for any of their important moments unless his family was watching. My ex tried to deny it, but then my youngest spoke up. She told everyone how they hadn't even been invited to this vacation until she'd overheard about it by accident. She called him out for being a terrible father, and honestly, it was like watching years of built-up hurt and anger pour out. She ran out of the restaurant crying, with her brothers running after her to make sure she was okay. Later that night, I got this angry text from my ex, blaming me for ruining his family. I didn't respond. Part of me felt guilty about the timing. Maybe a family vacation wasn't the best place for all this to come out. But another part of me was relieved that the truth was finally out in the open. I thought that would be the end of it, but the next evening, something unexpected happened. I was in my hotel room when someone started pounding on my door. When I opened it, there stood Sarah looking completely frantic. Sarah burst into my room, searching everywhere and yelling about her husband being there. I was confused but let her look around because she seemed really upset. When she couldn't find him, she just collapsed on the floor crying. I didn't know what to do. Here was the woman who had broken up my marriage, sitting on my hotel room floor having a breakdown. Then she started talking. She told me everything. How my ex had been mentally abusive to her for the past 17 years. How when she was just 18, he'd promised to leave me for her. Every time she'd ask when he was going to do it, he'd get angry and lash out at her. So she got pregnant on purpose to force his hand. What shocked me most was learning that he had tried to pay her to get rid of the baby. But when I found out about their affair and filed for divorce, he figured he had no choice but to marry her. She told me how he'd spent years telling her she'd ruined his life, calling her useless, and apparently cheating on her too. She stayed because she had nowhere else to go. She dropped out of college and hadn't worked since that secretary job when she was 18. After she left my room, I sent a quick text to my ex letting him know his wife seemed unstable and he should check on her. I didn't get a response that night, but the next morning, I woke up to a long message from him. He wrote this whole thing about how sorry he was for cheating on me, saying it was the biggest mistake of his life. He told me he hated seeing Sarah and their daughter every day, that he'd taken extra work hours just to avoid going home. Then he had the nerve to suggest that maybe, after all these years, we could try to fix our relationship. I shut that down immediately. I told him I was happily remarried, our kids were grown, and we had no reason to have any relationship beyond being co-parents to our adult children. I suggested he focus on fixing things with his current family instead. I decided to leave the vacation early. My youngest didn't want to stay either, so we went home together. My sons stayed behind, but they kept texting me updates about how everything was falling apart. My ex and Sarah weren't speaking to each other, and the whole family was walking on eggshells. Looking back now, I realize karma really does come around. The man who threw away our family for a teenage girl spent 17 years punishing her for his own choices. The successful image he tried so hard to maintain came crashing down because of his own lies. My kids are doing great despite his absence, and I'm happy in my new life. The only person I really feel sorry for is Sarah. Yes, she made terrible choices as a teenager, but she paid for them with 17 years of abuse. And now her daughter is following a similar path, getting pregnant young. Sometimes I wonder if things would have been different if she'd just let him pay her off back then and gone to college instead. But I guess we'll never know. All I know is that I'm grateful for where I am now. My kids are successful and happy, I have a loving husband, and I don't have to pretend anymore. Sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead us to the best places in life. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that subscribe button to help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Don't forget to give it a thumbs up and share it with friends or family who might enjoy it too. Your support means a lot. And if you have any thoughts, questions, or story ideas, drop them in the comments below. I'd love to hear from you. See you in the next story.